Here's what nobody is telling you. Right now, as you watch this video, the clock is ticking. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran expires on the 22nd of April. And the talks that were supposed to stop the next war just collapsed. 21 hours. That is how long the most important diplomatic meeting of the 21st century lasted before it fell apart in a conference room in Islamabad, Pakistan. 21 hours of negotiations, 21 hours of pressure, 21 hours of the entire world holding its breath, and then nothing. No deal, no framework, no path forward. Just two delegations boarding their planes and flying home in opposite directions, each one blaming the other for the failure. Now, I want you to think about what that means. This was not just another failed diplomatic summit. This was the first direct, face-to-face conversation between the United States and Iran since 1979. Think about that number for a moment. 1979, that is 47 years of silence, 47 years of proxy wars and sanctions and threats and assassination campaigns and nuclear standoffs. And the first time these two countries finally sat down in the same room, they could not even agree on the basics. They could not even agree on what the agenda was supposed to be. I have been studying geopolitics and international relations for more than 20 years. I have watched diplomacy succeed and I have watched diplomacy fail. But what happened in Islamabad on the 11th of April, 2026 is something I have never seen before. This was not a negotiation that failed because the two sides were far apart. This was a negotiation that was designed to fail. And when I show you what actually happened inside that building, when I walk you through the 21 hours, hour by hour, and show you what each side was actually demanding and why, you will understand exactly what I mean. This was not a breakdown. This was a performance. And the audience was not the Iranian delegation or the American delegation. The audience was you. The audience was the world. And the question you have to ask yourself is this: if both sides knew this deal was impossible, why did they show up at all? By the time this video is over, I am going to give you the answer to that question. And I promise you the answer is more disturbing than anything the mainstream media has reported. Because what happened in Islamabad is not just a diplomatic failure. It is a signal. It is a warning about what is coming next. And you need to understand it before the 22nd of April arrives. So let us begin. Let me give you a fact that most people in the Western media have completely forgotten. The negotiations in Islamabad did not happen because the United States and Iran decided to be reasonable. They happened because 40 days of war had shaken the entire global economy to its foundation, and both sides needed a pause. That is the honest truth about why those delegations got on their planes and flew to Pakistan. Not goodwill, not diplomacy, not statesmanship, exhaustion, mutual exhaustion. And understanding that distinction is absolutely critical to understanding why the talks failed. So let me take you back to the beginning, because the context matters enormously here. The conflict that brought the United States and Iran to a conference table in Islamabad did not begin with a single dramatic event. It built over months, through a series of escalations and miscalculations, until the moment when American and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes on Iranian territory. The stated objective was the neutralization of Iran's nuclear program. The actual result was 40 days of war that nobody had fully planned for and nobody knew how to end. During those 40 days, Iran used its most powerful strategic weapon, the Strait of Hormuz. For nearly 3 weeks, the strait through which approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply travels was effectively disrupted. Oil prices surged to over $90 per barrel. Global shipping costs exploded. The American economy, already struggling under the weight of tariff wars and domestic political pressure, began to show serious strain. Markets were volatile. Allies in the Gulf were terrified. And then came the ceasefire brokered, not in Washington, not in Geneva, not in Brussels, but in Islamabad, through the quiet but consequential diplomatic work of Pakistan. As I showed in my previous video, with the significant behind-the-scenes involvement of China, the ceasefire gave both sides 2 weeks to breathe, 2 weeks to sit down and try to find a way out. And that is how we arrived at the morning of the 11th of April, with 2 delegations checking into hotels in Islamabad, preparing for what everyone knew would be the most difficult conversation of their careers. The Americans came with a list of demands, the Iranians came with a list of conditions, and nobody had bothered to check in advance whether those 2 lists had anything in common. That is not an accident. That is a choice. And it is the first thing that tells you everything you need to know about what was really happening in Islamabad. I want you to think about this for a moment, because I think it reveals something profound about how the United States approached these negotiations. While Vice President J.D. Vance was sitting in a conference room in Islamabad, negotiating the terms of a potential peace agreement that could determine whether a new war would start in 10 days. The President of the United States was at a pay-per-view mixed martial arts event in Miami. He was watching combat sports. He was posting on social media about the fights, and his vice president was 8,000 miles away trying to stop an actual war. Now, you might say that is just the way this administration operates. You might say the president was getting briefings between fights, that modern communication technology means he was fully engaged. And maybe that is true. But I want you to think about what signal that sends to the Iranian delegation sitting across the table. Because in diplomacy, signals matter more than words. And the signal that the American side was sending was this: we are not desperate, we are not afraid of failure, we can take this or leave it. And if we leave it, the consequences fall on you, not on us. That signal was reinforced by the official American negotiating position, which by all accounts was presented not as an opening offer, but as what multiple sources described as a final offer. Think about that phrase, a final offer. You do not bring a final offer to the first direct conversation in 47 years. You bring a final offer when you have already decided that you want the other side to reject it. And what was in this final offer? According to reports from multiple outlets that were briefed after the talks collapsed, the American demands included full and unfettered international access to all Iranian nuclear facilities, a permanent and legally binding commitment to keep the Strait of Hormuz open to international shipping, a complete cessation of Iranian support for regional armed groups, including Hezbollah and the Houthi movement in Yemen, and the disarmament and disbanding of the Iranian proxy network across the broader Middle East. Let me say that again slowly, because I want you to understand what this list actually represents. The United States was asking Iran to dismantle, in a single agreement, everything that Iran has spent 47 years building as its strategic deterrent against American and Israeli military power. The nuclear program, the proxy network, the control over the strait. Every single one of these elements is not just a policy choice for Iran. Each one is an existential insurance policy. Each one exists precisely because Iran has watched what happened to countries that gave up their deterrence without guaranteed security in return. And the United States walked into that room and said, give us all of it now, or the war resumes in 10 days. That is not diplomacy. That is an ultimatum wearing a necktie. Here is a detail that almost no Western journalist has properly explained. The Iranian delegation that arrived in Islamabad was operating under conditions of extraordinary internal pressure that had nothing to do with the Americans across the table. Iran lost its supreme leader during the conflict. The entire decision-making architecture that Iran had operated under for decades was in transition. And the delegation that sat down across from J.D. Vance was not just representing a country at war. It was representing a country in the middle of a political and ideological reconstruction that its adversaries were actively trying to exploit. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf led the Iranian delegation. He is the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, a former commander in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and a man with one of the most difficult jobs in Iranian politics, projecting strength to his domestic audience while being flexible enough to prevent the resumption of a war that had already cost Iran enormously. And he walked into those negotiations carrying what Iranian sources described as 4 non-negotiable red lines. Not preferences, not aspirations, red lines. Conditions so fundamental that crossing any single one of them would have meant political destruction for any Iranian official who agreed to it. What were those conditions? First, Iran's right to a peaceful nuclear program, not just enrichment at low levels, but the recognized right under international law to continue developing civilian nuclear technology on Iranian soil. Second, the immediate lifting of all sanctions that had been imposed since 2018, including the so-called maximum pressure sanctions that had crippled the Iranian economy. Third, a complete halt to Israeli military operations targeting Iranian-backed forces in Lebanon, Syria, and the broader region. And fourth, and this is the one that I think most fundamentally broke the talks, an explicit written American security guarantee that the United States would not seek regime change in Iran. Not implicitly, not through diplomatic language, explicitly in writing. Now, think about that fourth condition for a moment, because it is the most psychologically revealing demand that Iran could possibly have made. Iran did not just want a nuclear deal. Iran did not just want sanctions relief. Iran wanted the United States to sign a document saying that it would not try to destroy the Islamic Republic as a political system. That is what 47 years of hostility produces. That is the residue of the 1953 coup, of the Iran-Iraq war that America quietly supported, of the assassination of General Soleimani, of decades of covert operations and cyber attacks and economic warfare. Iran came to Islamabad not just to negotiate the terms of a ceasefire. Iran came to Islamabad asking a fundamental question: can we trust you enough to stop building the things we built because we cannot trust you? And the answer it received was silence. Imagine two people who have not spoken a single word directly to each other in 47 years. They have screamed at each other through intermediaries. They have sent each other threatening messages through allies and proxies. They have tried to destroy each other through sanctions and sabotage and military strikes. And now they are in a room together, separated by a table and a translator, and 4.5 decades of accumulated grievance. And they have 21 hours to figure out whether there is anything left worth saving. That is what happened in that conference room in Islamabad. And what happened over those 21 hours tells you more about the state of American foreign policy than anything you will read in any newspaper. The talks began on the morning of Saturday, the 11th of April. The Pakistani Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar opened the session with a formal statement about Pakistan's commitment to peace and stability in the region. Then the two delegations sat down for what was described by multiple sources as an intense opening exchange. The Americans went first. They presented their framework, which, as I described in the previous chapter, was essentially a comprehensive demand for Iranian strategic disarmament in exchange for sanctions relief and a commitment not to resume bombing. The Iranian side listened, then they responded, and their response, according to sources briefed on the talks, was to reject the American framework entirely before the first coffee break. Here's what the timeline looked like, based on reporting from the national news, the Times of India, and multiple other outlets that spoke to people inside and outside the negotiating rooms. The morning session lasted approximately 4 hours and ended without any agreement on even a basic framework for discussion. The Pakistani mediators spent the afternoon shuttling between the two delegations in separate rooms, trying to find any point of convergence. By early evening, there were reports of what one source described as numerous messages and texts being exchanged between the delegations, not in person, but through written communications passed back and forth. Sometime around midnight, there was a brief moment when observers thought a partial agreement on the nuclear inspection question might be within reach. But then the Iranian side received instructions from Tehran, and those instructions, according to multiple accounts, were to hold firm on all 4 conditions without exception. By the time the sun rose on Sunday morning over Islamabad, both delegations knew the talks were over. The final session lasted less than an hour. There was no joint statement. There was no agreed communique. There was no announcement of a next round. J.D. Vance walked out of that building and told reporters that the failure was, in his exact words, worse for Iran than for the United States. And Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf held his own press conference and blamed the collapse entirely on what he called the excessive and unrealistic demands of the American side. 21 hours, 47 years of silence. And they ended up exactly where? They started pointing fingers at each other across an ocean while the clock counted down toward the 22nd of April. Here is a number that the American media almost never puts in context: 20%. That is the share of the entire world's daily oil supply that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Not 10%, not 5%, 20%. Every single day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil move through a waterway that is, at its narrowest point, only 33 kilometers wide. And Iran sits on the northern shore of that strait with missiles, drones, and naval assets pointed directly at every tanker that passes through. That is not a strategic asset. That is the most powerful economic weapon on earth. And the United States walked into Islamabad and told Iran to surrender it permanently and unconditionally. And then they were surprised when Iran said no. Let me break down the specific demands that collapsed the talks, because each one deserves individual attention, and each one reveals a different dimension of why this negotiation was structurally impossible from the moment it was announced. The first and most immediate point of conflict was the Strait of Hormuz. The American position was clear and non-negotiable. Iran must provide a legally binding, internationally monitored commitment to keep the strait open to commercial shipping under all circumstances, including circumstances where Iran believes it is under attack. In plain language, the United States was asking Iran to permanently surrender its most powerful conventional deterrent as a precondition for the talks producing any result. Iran's response was equally clear. The strait is Iranian sovereign territory. Iran has the right under international law to defend its territorial waters. And no country that is simultaneously demanding Iranian disarmament while maintaining its own military forces in the region has any standing to make that demand. The second fatal point of disagreement was the nuclear program. The American position, consistent with the so-called maximum pressure strategy, was comprehensive verification and access, meaning international inspectors with the right to visit any Iranian facility, declared or undeclared, at any time without advance notice. The Iranian position was equally firm. Iran had already signed a nuclear agreement in 2015. The United States unilaterally withdrew from that agreement in 2018 under the previous Trump administration. Iran had complied with the deal, America had broken it, and Iran was not prepared to sign a new and even more restrictive version of the same agreement without ironclad guarantees that America would not simply walk away again the moment a new political wind blew through Washington. That is not an unreasonable position. That is the position of a country that has been betrayed once and refuses to be betrayed again. The third dimension was the question of Hezbollah and Iran's broader regional network. American and Israeli intelligence had spent years documenting the depth and reach of Iranian support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, various armed factions in Iraq, the Houthi movement in Yemen, and other affiliated groups across the region. From the American and Israeli perspective, dismantling this network was not just a negotiating demand, it was the entire strategic purpose of the military campaign. Iran built this network precisely because it provides strategic depth and deterrence against military attack. Asking Iran to dismantle it in a negotiation that takes place while American forces remain in the region and Israel continues operating in Lebanon is not a diplomatic request. It is a demand for unconditional surrender. And no Iranian government, regardless of ideology, could accept unconditional surrender and survive politically. Ask yourself this question and think carefully before you answer. Why would Pakistan, a country with its own enormous internal challenges, a country balancing between American financial pressure and Chinese strategic investment, a country with nuclear weapons and a fragile civilian government. Why would Pakistan volunteer to host the most dangerous diplomatic negotiation of the decade? Why would Islamabad put itself in the position of being the venue where either a historic peace agreement would be signed or a catastrophic diplomatic failure would unfold, with global consequences in either direction? The answer to that question reveals something fundamental about the new geography of international power, and it is something that almost nobody in Washington seems to understand. Pakistan agreed to host these talks because China asked it to. This is not speculation. This is the logical conclusion of a pattern that has been visible for months. Pakistan is a country where China has invested over $60 billion through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative. Pakistan's foreign policy, especially on regional security questions, is deeply aligned with Chinese strategic interests. And China's strategic interest in these negotiations was exactly what I described in my previous video. China wants to position itself as the indispensable diplomatic player in the Middle East, and hosting the talks through its closest ally was the perfect way to demonstrate that capability. Pakistani Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar threw himself into the role of mediator with genuine energy and commitment. He shuttled between delegations. He made phone calls at midnight. He issued statements urging both sides to show flexibility. And when the talks collapsed, he stood in front of cameras and made one of the most important statements of the entire episode. He called on both sides to respect the existing ceasefire and to return to dialogue. Not both sides had failed equally. Not both sides share the blame. He specifically called on both sides to respect the ceasefire. That is the language of a man who understood that the collapse of the talks does not mean the end of the ceasefire, and who was desperately trying to prevent the military escalation that would follow if the ceasefire expired without a replacement agreement. Whether his appeal was heard is the most important open question of the next 10 days. Pay very close attention to the exact words that J.D. Vance chose when he walked out of that building in Islamabad and faced the cameras. He did not say the talks had failed. He did not say both sides had been unable to reach an agreement. He said, and I am paraphrasing from multiple accounts of his statement, that the failure of these talks was worse for Iran than for the United States. Read those words again. Worse for Iran than for the United States. That is not the language of a man who went to Islamabad hoping to find a deal. That is the language of a man who went to Islamabad prepared for the deal to fail and ready to use that failure as a threat. It is the language of someone who wanted the talks to collapse so long as the collapse could be blamed on the other side. Now compare that to the statement that Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf gave at his own press conference almost simultaneously. Ghalibaf said that the United States had come to Islamabad with demands that were excessive, unrealistic, and incompatible with Iranian sovereignty. He said that Iran had come in good faith, and the Americans had come with preconditions designed to make agreement impossible. He said, and this is the phrase I want you to remember, that America did not come to make peace, it came to declare victory. Those are two completely different framings of exactly the same 21 hours. And the fact that they are so completely different is itself the most important piece of information to emerge from these talks. When two parties leave the same negotiation with diametrically opposite accounts of what happened, it means one of two things. Either one side is lying, or both sides went in with completely different ideas about what the negotiation was actually for. What strikes me most about the post-collapse messaging from both sides is not what was said publicly. It is what was conspicuously absent. Neither side mentioned a next round. Neither side proposed a mechanism for continuing the dialogue. Neither side suggested a confidence-building measure, a small, reversible step that could keep the door open while the fundamental disagreements were addressed through back-channel communication. The complete absence of any forward-looking diplomatic language from either delegation tells you that both sides left Islamabad not just without a deal, but without any serious intention of returning to the table before the ceasefire expires. And that silence is far more frightening than anything either Vance or Ghalibaf said out loud. The clock is running. At the time this video is being recorded, the ceasefire between the United States and Iran expires in 10 days. 10 days. And as of this moment, there is no scheduled next round of talks. There is no agreed framework for continuing the dialogue. There is no back channel that any credible reporting has identified as active and productive. There is a ceasefire that both sides agreed to under enormous international pressure, and that ceasefire is scheduled to expire on the 22nd of April, and nobody in a position of authority in either Washington or Tehran has publicly committed to extending it. That is where we are. And I want to be very precise with you about what the scenarios look like from here, because I think there is an enormous amount of false reassurance circulating in the media about what happens next. The first scenario is the one that most optimistic analysts are pointing to: a ceasefire extension without a comprehensive agreement. Under this scenario, both sides agree, probably through Pakistani and Chinese intermediaries, to extend the ceasefire by another 2 weeks or perhaps 30 days, buying time for a new round of negotiations. This is possible. It is even probable, because the alternative is so catastrophic that rational actors on both sides have strong incentives to avoid it. But here is the problem with this scenario. Every time a ceasefire gets extended without meaningful progress toward a permanent agreement, the political cost of the next extension goes up. The hardliners on both sides grow stronger. The moderates lose credibility. And the window for a genuine diplomatic solution gets narrower. A ceasefire extension is not a solution. It is a postponement. And postponements have a way of running out. The second scenario is the one that nobody wants to say out loud, but that the evidence points toward a partial resumption of hostilities, not a full return to the 40-day war, not an immediate re-escalation to the peak intensity of the conflict, but targeted strikes, Hormuz disruptions, drone operations, and the kind of controlled violence that both sides use to signal displeasure and apply pressure without triggering all-out war. This scenario is dangerous precisely because it is controllable at first. The history of conflicts in this region shows repeatedly that limited, controlled violence has a tendency to escalate in ways that neither side intended and neither side can stop. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has already issued statements warning that Iran will resume its strategic response to American aggression if the ceasefire expires without a satisfactory agreement. Those are not empty words. They are operational signals from a military organization that has demonstrated its willingness and capability to act. The third scenario, and I want to be honest with you that I think this is less likely but not impossible, is a complete collapse of the ceasefire and a return to full-scale conflict. If the 22nd of April arrives with no agreement and no extension, and if either side makes a military miscalculation in the tense days that follow, this conflict could restart at a level of intensity that makes the previous 40 days look like a prelude. Oil prices would immediately return to crisis levels. The global economy would face a shock that it is genuinely not prepared for. And the political consequences in Washington, in Tehran, and in capitals across the Middle East would be severe and unpredictable. This is the scenario that every responsible actor is working to prevent. Whether they will succeed is a question that will define the next 10 days. Here is the paradox that I want you to carry with you after you finish watching this video. The country that gained the most from the collapse of the Islamabad talks was not at the table. It did not send a delegation to Pakistan. It did not make any public statement about the failure of the negotiations. It did not congratulate itself or criticize either side. It simply watched and calculated and moved its pieces quietly while the world was distracted by the spectacle of American and Iranian diplomats walking out of a building in opposite directions. The country I am talking about is China. And the way China wins from the failure in Islamabad is so elegant and so precisely calculated that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Think about what the failure of the Islamabad talks does to the regional calculus. Every Gulf state that watched those negotiations, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, every single one of them is now asking the same question. If the United States could not bring Iran to an agreement, even after 40 days of military operations, even with the leverage of a ticking ceasefire clock, even with the full weight of American diplomatic and economic power behind its delegation, what does that say about America's ability to provide security in this region? The answer that Gulf state governments are drawing is deeply uncomfortable for Washington. It is the same conclusion that I predicted in my previous video. America is a military power without diplomatic credibility. And in the Middle East in 2026, diplomatic credibility is more valuable than aircraft carriers. China understands this. China has spent the past several weeks positioning itself as the responsible, stable, peace-seeking alternative to American confrontation. China brokered the original ceasefire through Pakistan. China's foreign minister made 26 phone calls to regional leaders. And now, after the Islamabad collapse, China is the only major power that can credibly say to both sides, we have relationships with you both, we have leverage with you both, and we are not trying to humiliate either of you. That is an extraordinary position to be in. And it is a position that translates directly into economic and strategic influence. Because when the rebuilding of Iran begins, and it will begin, regardless of how this conflict ultimately resolves, it will be Chinese companies that build the infrastructure, Chinese banks that finance the reconstruction, and Chinese engineers who install the systems. The Belt and Road Initiative does not stop because America and Iran cannot agree on nuclear inspections. And here's the final thing I want you to understand, the thing that I believe will be the most important legacy of what happened in Islamabad. The failure of these talks is not just a failure of American diplomacy in this particular conflict. It is evidence of a deeper structural problem in how America approaches the world. America built its post-Cold War foreign policy on a very specific assumption that American military and economic power is so overwhelming that it does not need to genuinely negotiate with adversaries. It can simply present demands and wait for compliance. That assumption has been breaking down for years. But what happened in Islamabad is the moment when the breaking became visible to everyone. Iran sat across from the most powerful country in the history of the world, looked at its final offer and said no. And then it got on a plane and flew home. And the war did not immediately restart, and the world did not end. And that moment, that specific moment when an adversary said no to American ultimatums and the consequences were not immediate and catastrophic, that moment will be studied in foreign ministries and military academies from Beijing to Brasilia for the next 50 years. Because it signals something fundamental. It signals that the era of American diplomatic monopoly in the Middle East is over. Islamabad was not just where a deal failed to happen. Islamabad was where the old world order held its final press conference. The question now is not whether America can force a different outcome. The question is whether America can adapt quickly enough to operate in a world where its ultimatums are no longer automatically obeyed. The 22nd of April will give us the first answer. I will be here to analyze it with you. I will see you in the next one.